Welcome to another edition of the Nonprofit Leadership Studio. Hope everyone's doing well. I've got a great guest tonight, and we're trying something new, right? We're zooming in. We have someone, my good buddy Jerry Hawkins is up. He lives in Dallas, but today he's in Iowa. So we're zooming in with high quality web cameras to see how this works. For those of you that don't know Jerry, Jerry is the director of the Dallas Truth Racial Healing and Transformation up in Dallas. Jerry, how you doing? Can you see me okay?
I can. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Thank you so much. So, Jerry, you have such an interesting background, right? I mean, you've run nonprofits, you've done interesting things, and then your current job is fantastic, working on racial healing in Dallas. So I'm really excited to talk to you today. Tell me a little bit, Jerry, in terms of leadership in general from your perspective, right? So looking at the work that you did at Bachman Lakes in Dallas and the work that you're doing now, tell me a little bit about your leadership style. If you're writing a book on leadership, Jerry, what are some of the key components of that book?
For me, I think it's about knowing yourself and knowing your skills and your limitations. For me, I had to learn my leadership style very quickly if I was going to move societal issues. We talk about kind of this dream of saving the world that some of us young leaders have. And it really boils down to where can you make the most impact and where can my efforts be used the most. And so I had to learn very quickly that I was a visionary leader and that in order to be the most effective visionary leader, I needed people who had other skills around me. So that's really what I would say first is knowing yourself, knowing your limitations, but also knowing that you are, you have enough, you're skilled enough to do that, whatever the job is.
When did you figure, Jerry, when did you figure out that you were the leader that you are? What was your sort of first leadership experience where you figured out, hey, I can do this and I want to do something as a visionary leader and I want to do something with societal impact? What was your sort of first experience around that?
It was actually my first job. I worked right out of college. I worked for the Chicago Urban League. And it was a very interesting program. It's called the Male Involvement Program. It was probably the only fatherhood social service in the city of Chicago. And what happened is in a 6-month span, when I started, we lost our director. We lost the director of our bigger department, which is the human capital department. And our program was on our own. And we had to do reporting to a state department, which was Department of Human Services for the state of Illinois. And we had to figure out what we were going to do in order to keep our jobs, because we had to fill out the requirements for our grants. We had to do grant reporting. And that was kind of my first dive into leadership. I kind of, even as a new person, I kind of split up the grant reporting requirements, and we just started to dig in and to, find ways in order to keep the program running because we were serving about 250 fathers who relied on our services. We were trying to help them gain skills to reunify with their family. Most of the fathers had been incarcerated and were coming out of, the criminal justice system. And we were trying to find ways in which to get them skills, to get them, viable employment, increase their income, and then increase their parenting skills and their relationship skills. So that program was, very important to those 250 men who were, using that service. We wanted to keep it going. If we didn't do that grant reporting, it wouldn't have happened. Yeah. So that was my first dive into just leadership. You have to do it. That's really it. You need to, be a doer.
When you were running the nonprofit up in Dallas, the Bachman Lakes, and the working on early education in this community, basically you're fighting poverty in this community, and you were leading there. What did you find was it being a visionary that sort of made you most effective? Was it relationship skills? What is it that made you sort of most effective as a nonprofit leader?
So particularly for that job, it was a dream job.
Yeah.
I'll say a dream job for many different reasons. Number one, it was my community. And so for someone to find a job in a leadership capacity in your community is, for me is a dream job. Two, it was in my area. So how many of us, get undergrad degrees in an area and are able to work in that area?
Yeah.
I'm one of the few guys who actually has an early childhood degree. I was a double major in early childhood and child and family services. And so I got to build an early childhood system in my own, community, which was amazing. The second that this required kind of the out of the box thinking, because I had to design a family center. I had to build a community collaborative. I had to work with parents. I had to work with the city. I had to work with our school district. So it required a different type of skill set, kind of entrepreneurial, kind of even some hustling. You know what I mean? Like I'm talking about like street hustling, like hustling to get things and building, very uncanny relationships with community members who can watch your building while it's being constructed, and folks who can look out for your parents while they're looking for the family center to be built. So it required a different type of skill set, and I think I was ready for that.
Yeah. The job you're doing now, this whole idea of truth, racial healing, transformation, it's a big job, but you're doing it in Dallas, right? And we know we have, you and I have talked about this. I mean, there are a lot of racial issues in America, but Dallas is sort of a special place in regards to that. I mean, very different than Houston, right, in regards to how it looks at race. How is that? I mean, what's the skill for you there? Because my guess is there are a whole lot of people in Dallas that don't want to work on this issue, right?
It's been very interesting that I've been well received from the folks, and I think that we're in a place in our city where you have to find your space in racial equity. Dallas is a very interesting place. Is that in some measures, particularly when it comes to social issues, we're at the bottom.
Yeah.
Yesterday was election day. Dallas is, by a lot of different measures, the lowest municipal participation in elections for a large city. Dallas has been number one or number three worst in child poverty. The Urban Institute ranked Dallas 274 out of 274 at the bottom in overall inclusion for a city. So many measures, it's really nowhere to go but up in some of those measures. But it's also one of the wealthiest cities in our, in the state and also in the country. And there's a lot of room for growth. And I think that because Dallas is also a business model of a city, new ideas and innovations are met with some type of embrace. People embrace new ideas and they want to find out what's happening. So I think that's kind of what's happening with us. And I think that also the philanthropic partners like the Kellogg Foundation and the Communities Foundation also lend some type of respect and some notoriety to the work that's happening.
Yeah.
So folks want to just find out. I think they're in a kind of let's see what this is all about stage, and so we're prepared for that.
Let's talk a little bit about the nonprofit field and race issues. I mean, I sometimes think that within our field, we have a lot of people that are working for social justice, a lot of work going on, but we don't often look inward, do we, in terms of figuring out, are we doing the right things as a nonprofit community? What are your thoughts around that?
So that's one of the first questions I ask our community partners, and most of them are nonprofits, is what do you want to do? And when I ask them that, it's usually kind of a blank stare, because folks usually are mission driven when it comes to nonprofits. But we have to really talk about the root cause. Nonprofits are usually in communities of color, usually poor communities of color, and they assert that they are trying to fix a societal issue, whether it be poverty, homelessness, food insecurity. Um, but the mere existence of nonprofits in that community of color means something. It means that they are there because that social problem is in that community and it's probably not going to change anytime soon. So when I think about nonprofits, particularly older nonprofits that are 10, 15, 20, 30 years old, embedded in communities, in a brick and mortar headquarters with no viable solution on the social issue that they're trying to solve, it gets a little hairy to me. I get very worried about what they're actually doing and if they are more of the problem than the solution.
That's so interesting, right? Because that exact debate has been happening at United Ways around the country, right? Where United Ways are used to funding sort of the old line, big nonprofits that have the brick buildings and are doing this. They're addressing problems, but they're not necessarily solving those problems. Have you
That's
seen
right.
have you seen a lot of? I mean, I think in Dallas though, the United Way specifically said we're going to start trying to solve some of these problems. Have you seen that sort of as a movement around the country where people try to solve problems rather than just addressing them?
Um, I would love to say yes, but that's
Yeah,
not the truth. Unfortunately, to solve some of our societal issues, you have to address root causes. And one of the one, probably the number one root cause in our country is race, issues of race and racism, and which is why we are, solely focused on talking about those issues. Um, I can give you an example of Bachman Lake together. It
yeah,
was chose we before I was hired. Um, that community was chosen because Hispanic families, Latinx families, are usually the lowest users of center-based care in 3 to 5, and so um, through a lot of data, they chose a community in North Dallas that is poor, that is um, brown, and that is primarily undocumented. That's a racial equity initiative. It's not in name. They didn't want to call it that, but that's what it was. We served 100% people of color. And so, how do we start to break down some of the barriers in our silos and start to talk about the real issues is the question. Um, unless folks are talking about root cause issues, there will be no solving of societal problems, particularly when we talk about systems. The first organization I worked for in Dallas, they called themselves a poverty prevention agency, which is a misnomer because we operate in a system of capitalism. Capitalism says there's going to be a permanent poor and a permanent wealthy, and folks are going to be in between. Unless we're talking about that system and changing that system, there's no way we can do poverty prevention. Someone's going to be poor. My organization, for instance, is fighting against the racial hierarchy within that system, right? We don't want race to be a determining factor in which people decide if they're going to be rich or poor. So, but that's the system we live in. We live in capitalism where it needs that. And so, how do nonprofits operate to solve systems? They have to do root cause analysis and fight the root of the problem.
does Jerry, does it sometimes scare people when they hear you talk about things like if we're going to talk about poverty, we have to realize it's going to continue to exist as long as we live in a capitalistic society? I mean, do people sometimes get a little
Oh,
nervous around that?
100%. But I think what's important is history and data. Um, Folks can deny studies. Folks can deny some data sets. They cannot deny history. Um, and so when you pair history with data, it tells a different type of story. Um, the Communities Foundation and JP Morgan Chase has released a racial wealth gap report for Dallas. And it told a lot of this historical analysis story, this story that says that federal government policy like segregation and redlining contributed to the racial wealth gap. And that's history that happened. You can't deny that history, and they paired it with data. It tells a different type of story. So folks have to really engage in that conversation if they're really trying to change that stuff. It's just a different story.
Yeah, yeah. Jerry, give us a little bit of an idea of your background. Did you grow up in Chicago?
I grew up in Chicago. Grew up on the south side of Chicago, in a neighborhood called Inglewood. My neighborhood is the neighborhood that the current administration in the White House talks about all the time. It was definitely a rough neighborhood, but it was what I knew. It was I felt that being a loving community with of course, some need that went addressed. Some historical needs that went neglected by the city, of course, because of some of those policies that we talked about before.
Yeah.
And so I was one of the fortunate ones because I was able to go to some of those desegregation schools that they called magnet schools. I went to Beasley Academic Center, which was a magnet school right across from one of the largest public housing projects in the country called Robert Taylor Projects. And then I went to Whitney Young Magnet High School, which was basically a feeder school into great institutions like the University of Illinois and Ivy League schools. So,
yeah.
I was one of the few. I had to go 1 hour outside of my community in order to receive this type of education, which was obviously a travesty for folks. But that was kind of my, there was so many folks that were left behind who didn't have those privileges.
When you look at your background too, I mean, the idea that you've done art, the idea that you've traveled abroad, they almost seem a little, they seem a little different, right? Tell me a little bit about that, how that ended up happening, because that background also sort of really contributes to your ability to succeed now, interestingly though, right?
That's right. So starting with art, I think that it just, the total credit goes to my mom. She was very resourceful. She's also an educator. She, recently retired from Chicago Public Schools. But she was able to take us to libraries and to just advocate for her children. In fourth grade, my art teacher noticed that I can draw, and there was this teacher scholarship called ART, Art Resources and Teaching, that took inner city kids out of their community and let them go to classes at the Art Institute of Chicago every Saturday and Sunday. And so from sixth grade until I graduated from high school, I attended those classes. By the time I was a junior in high school, I was actually teaching college classes on graphic design. So those were, amazing experiences. I mean, another program advocated for me to go to is Upward Bound, which was a federally funded TRIO program that allowed inner city kids to go to colleges within the city and stay on the farms in the summer and go through college curriculum while we were in high school. So experiences like that were invaluable to my upbringing. And when I got to college, study abroad, actually seeing different people and cultures, you get to see a different type of poverty. So while we have homeless here in the United States, homelessness in another country, an undeveloped country, as they say, and I don't even like that word, but it looks different. It's just totally different. I saw things that no one would ever want to have anyone go through. And so it definitely changed my worldview and definitely kind of focused my attention on trying to think about impact instead of intention.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to go to the Twitterverse here to see what people are tweeting in. But, just looking at your background there, Jerry, you're in Iowa. You're about to you're doing a keynote address tomorrow. Is that what you're doing?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm giving a keynote to Hope Street Group's phenomenal group called the Retail Opportunity Network. Retail Opportunity Network is a group more than 100 businesses and retailers that are looking to transform the way their system works. And I'm going to give a keynote entitled Equity in the Workplace. And I'm going to interview a couple of folks, one from the Aspen Institute, and one of them is someone who's working in digital equity, about some of the equity issues that we're facing.
When are they going to give you one of those MacArthur Genius Awards, Jerry? When's that going to happen?
When I start to write stuff. So yeah, I'm looking for some time so I can have to write. Talking to you about a couple of ideas I have, so I need some time.
Yeah. Wow. I know it's going to happen. All right. Let's go to the Twitterverse here and see what happens. Yeah. So Tisha wants to know, based upon your experience with nonprofits, do you think organizations would be more effective if they were more collaborative with other nonprofits? So collaboration, yes. What do you think?
So yes, in my nonprofit space, I've worked for two foundations, the Dallas Foundation, now collaborating with Communities Foundation and Kellogg Foundation. And I definitely believe that all roads lead to collaboration. Right now, my job is, it wouldn't happen without collaboration. Equity work doesn't happen in silos, it happens in community, and we need as many folks as possible. So I don't even think that you can even make social impact doing siloed work. You have to work with people, and you have to build new types of systems and new types of ways of being for your community, and that only comes through collaboration.
I almost feel, Jerry, that one of the mistakes that leaders make is the idea that they're going to do it on their own and they're not going to collaborate, right? We all know most nonprofits seem to collaborate, but there are a few that don't play well with others, right? And
That's right.
I always feel like it's a leadership mistake to say, I'm not going to collaborate. It's harder to collaborate, but it's much more effective.
It is much more effective. It really takes you thinking about people. And I know that sounds so simple, but it's a hard thing when folks are embedded in the way that they carry out their mission. A lot of folks are very mission driven, and that mission might have been for another time. Yeah, the times we live in, the world is evolving very fast. Not just with technology, but with the way that the world works, the way that race is now being thrown into our national politics, the way that policy is being driven by some of those sentiments. We need collaboration. We need folks to understand each other, particularly across racial, gender categories, sexuality categories. We need more collaboration and understanding. Because if you are not understanding, this new demographics that are happening, population shifts, particularly in cities like Dallas and Houston, you don't.
So Myra Rock wants to know, to date, what's been your biggest leadership challenge that you've faced in your career?
My biggest leadership challenge, so many of them, because you gotta, when you find, you want to be a leader until people are depending on you to take care of their families. And I definitely shifted the way I think from doing direct service to being a leader. And so my biggest leadership challenge is probably working with groups in philanthropy, because I think that money changes the conversation around community work, and trying to sustain that work, you need more money. And so making decisions with people about money means that they have to have a say in the way the work is carried out. And community work is very different than philanthropy work in the sense that the community has different needs than what philanthropy thinks you should do. And so it's really been that trying to bridge the disconnect between folks who can provide resources for community work and actually the community needs on the ground. That's been my biggest leadership challenge.
Mm-hmm. Good, thanks. Sarah D wants to know, how do you make sure your organization grows and is visible to the public? That's visibility. How do you focus on visibility?
So I focus on visibility through relationships, and it's not a cliche. As a fledgling and growing organization, I try to meet with everybody who wants to meet with me. So I haven't turned down a meeting yet. I have my schedule. If you follow me, I have maybe like 4 or 5 meetings a day, and really just talking with folks over coffee or buying them lunch or hanging out with them, and really just talking about their goals for their organization and how we can help each other. As a small organization as well, we don't have a lot of capacity. So that means that finding kind of a mutually, a way that we can mutually help each other is very important. Some folks really just may need some refreshments. They may need you to buy some refreshments so they can continue serving their people, or they may need you to buy books, or they may need you to talk about race because they don't have that knowledge yet. So it really just finding ways in which you can help folks and showing up for folks is the best way to do that.
How many lunches do you spend at your desk, Jerry, or mostly you out with relationships?
0. I maybe go there. This week I went there to pick up this camera that we're using right now, and I was not there. So,
I think that's interesting, right? Because sometimes I'll talk to nonprofit leaders and they'll talk about eating at their desk, and I'm like you, right? Almost unless someone cancels at the last minute, right? I might go out, but I always feel like lunch, breakfast, coffee, happy hours are just these very important times for leadership and for relationship building. And if you miss that opportunity, you're not getting out enough, right? And it's a big deal. It's a big part of leadership.
That's right. That's right. I think about what we do as community. So for me, as a person who is running an organization, I do have this obligation to my organization, but you also have obligation to community too. So what I find is that most folks who are really serious about community leadership are doing way more things than just their organization. And I'm not just talking about sitting on boards. I'm talking about being engaged in policy. They're on task force. They are helping folks their own organizations. They're mentoring people because they really know that there's a need for community leadership. And we need more. We need more leaders, active leaders, people who are doing things, talking about real issues very explicitly. We need more of us, and there's just not a lot of us.
Yeah, that's for sure. Myra wants to know, how do you prioritize the issues you tackle within the community? How do you do a lot of that prioritizing?
Well, this has been very interesting is that with this role that I'm in now, it's really very prioritized. The priority is about race, racial equity, racism, and racial healing. And so I really don't do work outside of those 4 areas. And so the priority is building community capacity to first talk about these issues, and then to build policy and practice areas around those issues so we can move the needle towards justice for those issues. And so it's a really good framework. And I think that the only thing that's missing is, folks taking some courage to move some of the community needle stuff. It's a lot of hard. They call it very difficult history, but it's history from growing pains of a city that um, is built on the genocide and the removal of Native people. Is built on slavery. And I think in the suburbs there in Houston, they just found a former graveyard from folks who were working in like prison labor.
Right.
So like that history has to be accounted for. We have to find out what it means to a city. What does it mean for us going forward? So those are some of the challenges and things we're tackling.
Yeah. Athena Moss Thomas wants to know, in your varied nonprofit experiences, where do you think, of all the places, you've had the most impact?
Wow. So yeah, at my last role, I think I had the most impact. I was executive director of Bachman Lake Together, which was an early childhood collective impact initiative. And my first task in that role was to design and build a family center. Now, mind you, I only took architecture 1 and 2 in high school. So it was the last time I actually designed a floor plan of a house or, an actual house. But this was actually a 13 office family center with 4 adult classrooms, with 7 early childhood classrooms. I really had to consider, the community need first. I had to consider, what the community collaborations were, that were going to happen. And I was able to build a space that's still there that parents look as a refuge now. And that's important. So that's just the physical space, but I was also able to build a community collaboration space in which we brought things that were not in my community into the community. So for instance, although we were focused on building capacity for early childhood, we were able to bring Dallas Theater Center in to do theater classes because we didn't have any arts buildings or structures or galleries in our community. And that partnership still lasts today. And parents are able to get theater classes right at the family center and also participate in Dallas Theater Center events downtown. So linkages and relationships like that are life-changing. If someone's on stage or someone's able, like for me when I was a kid, engaging with art changed my life. So I hope that, some of those things have the same effect for some of our families in Buffalo.
So Abby Johnson wants to know, how did you first get your foot in the door in the profit sector? So I guess that first job at the Urban League, right? How did you get your foot in the door there?
So very practically, I decided that nonprofit was the way to go for me for my career because I started my family very early. And I knew that nonprofits had some type of flexibility. So I was able to work out a schedule where I was able to pick up my kids from school. I was able to take my kids to the doctor if needed be, because I was in the nonprofit sector. Also some very interesting things about my nonprofit experience was that it was a great experience because I worked in one of the largest civil rights organizations in the country, which is the National Urban League affiliate. Chicago Urban League is over 100 years old. I worked in a very specific area, and so that was important too, because a specific area allowed me to be in a space where I worked with all men and all men of color. And that was important to me being stable. I actually worked there for 8 years. My first job, I worked there for 8 years. That doesn't happen anymore for folks my age back then. So, and it only happened because I was in this very comfortable environment and building this expertise, building practice on the craft that I was doing. But also I was very ambitious and, trying to be involved in some of the other things and initiatives that the Urban League was doing. One of the initiatives is that we created a Boys Leadership Institute. It's actually an early childhood program for single mother head of households. They wanted their young boys to have exposure to men in their lives. And so we had an all male staff come and every Saturday teach a very specific curriculum around manhood, around being Black and brown. And we did yoga instead of basketball. So it was a very good collaboration with the University of Chicago and their charter school there, and it's still there today. So things like that are very important.
Jerry, Emily McGovern wants to know, as a leader, what do you find, or how do you motivate your team? You know, when you look at some of the nonprofit jobs you've had in your teams, what's been the big motivators, and how do you motivate them as a leader?
That's a great question because people need so many different things. It's almost like being a good parent. And I say that because I'm a parent right now, and all of my kids are different and they have different needs. It's actually an equity question. The biggest part of being a leader of people is finding out what they need and what they're good at. I used to think delegation was just giving people jobs and a task and having them do it, but delegation is about giving someone a task that they can succeed in. And if you can give them something that they can succeed in, they have a sense of ownership of the mission and the work of the organization. For me, also, at Bachman Lake Together, we're trying to do something very different. Usually, for nonprofits, it's a very hierarchical structure. I was trying to do this thing called shared power, in which folks, knew that I was the executive director, but I shared some of those very important responsibilities with the folks that work with me, and left that task for them. Regardless if they messed up or made a mistake or not, I left that task for them, and they had to own that task. And that built a good team for me because folks were able to work in their skill set. I was not a micromanager, but I wanted to make sure that they had everything they needed to be successful. So shared power is very important to me, and I think that that's the way moving forward for organizations if you are going to build capacity and have folks stay on your team.
So a couple of fun questions for you, Jerry, before we finish up tonight. So your spare time, what does time after work look like for you?
So time after work, I'm a big reader. I have like an addiction to buying books and reading books. So I am like a history of cities junkie. So every city I travel to, I try to buy a book about it and read about it. I want to know how it was formed. So that's one of my hobbies, but I think it's just practice. Two is spending time with my children. They're getting older. I have a senior in high school, a sophomore in high school, and a kid in 5th grade. And so it's really I view my work as also the work that they need to do as well as people. And so I take my kids to meetings with me as well, particularly community meetings. And one of the things I practice with them is make sure that they are prepared to ask a question, even if they don't get acknowledged and their question is not asked. They are prepared to engage in some of these policies that affect their lives as well. So that's one thing. I love doing that. My daughter goes to, my oldest goes to community meetings with me all the time. She actually uses her voice and talks about the issues. So those two, and also traveling. I think traveling is essential to expanding your worldview and being a good leader. So I love traveling.
Where's when you think about traveling, people, I travel a lot as well, and people often ask, hey, what's the best place you've ever traveled? For you, what's been the most interesting / best place you've ever traveled?
So I don't even know if there's a best place. I just think there's many different places. I have a quick story about my one travel. I went to Chiang Mai, which is in Thailand. It's a northern city in Thailand. and I was there for artist residency. So I was there for a month. One of the most interesting things happened to me during one of these processes. I was eating breakfast and my phone was on the table and it came up missing. And I knew that I can track the phone with the Apple technology. I tracked it, and I had a scooter that I rented to get around there. And the phone, I just saw it on the map. It just kept getting further and further away. So I went to the tourist police. They didn't even talk to me for a whole hour, and then they talked to me, and then they told me to get in the car. And we traveled 60 miles to this remote village. Make a long story short, there was a kid there who was deaf who found my phone. He said he thought I lost it. The whole village came out. I gave him some money for finding it. They thanked me. The men took me back. I ate raw buffalo and drank whiskey with them. It was a crazy story. But that only happens you are like traveling, better in the community, And after that, I went back with the tourist police, and they had a feast with me. And, I stayed at the police department and ate with them and drank with them. So.
And how was that raw buffalo? Was that raw buffalo okay?
Well, I didn't know. I was trying to drink the whiskey as soon as I could. So.
Of course. So your favorite restaurant right now in Dallas?
My favorite restaurant in Dallas is actually the one I took you to because I love Thai food. So that's Pak Pao Thai in Dallas. That's my favorite. Probably a second is Flower Child because it's a healthy restaurant. They use all good materials. I'm trying to lose some weight, so Flower Child. Sure.
There you go. Well, no, that Thai restaurant that we went to, that was really. What was the name of that again? That Thai restaurant?
It's called Pak Pao Thai.
Pak Pao. Yeah, very good. And then, are you binge watching any TV shows right now?
I rarely watch TV, but a couple of shows that I like are coming back on. So House of Cards. I'm excited to get some time and watch that, particularly now that there's a woman president. I don't know if you remember the show like 20 years ago, but Gina Davis was the president, and that was one of my favorite shows, and it only lasted a season.
Commander
so I'm
in
really
Chief.
interested in how women govern. Yeah, Commander in Chief, that's right. And so I'm really interested in how women govern. I think women are the future when it comes to governance. And so I think we should definitely follow that. So I'm interested in how that all plays out. So House of Cards. My favorite show is Game of Thrones. So I rewatch that all the time. Game of Thrones has everything in it. It has politics. It has geopolitical games, and it has race. It has all kind of stuff in there. So Game of Thrones is my favorite show of all time.
I love Game of Thrones. Jerry Hawkins, man, it's so good to talk to you. And it's hard, with the technology, but at least we get to see you, even though you're in Iowa. But to have you here in the studio with us and talking about leadership, it's good to see you. I need to come up to Dallas and talk to you again real soon, man. So take care. Thanks for doing all that you do, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Bob. It's always a pleasure.
All right. And for all of you watching, thanks for being a part of the Leadership Studio. Keep up the good work. We'll see you next time. Take care.
All right, thank you.